Hello and welcome to this episode of the Housing Geospatial podcast, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed because we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented in the housing sector. This series is around sharing a collective knowledge within the housing sector. You can find our group on LinkedIn or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I'm your host Chris Kinnear, and our guest today for this podcast is the ever enthusiastic Jonathan Gatward, who is the founder of InTouch Geospatial. Hi Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi there, Chris. Yeah, really looking forward to having a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start with our really standard first question. How are you involved in housing and or geospatial?
Well, it literally goes back to last century. I started off with doing a degree in geography and went on to do a MSc in GIS at Leicester University back in 1988. At the time, it was only the second in the country to actually be running, and it was the first year it was ever run at Leicester University. So things have changed a bit since then with the amount of GIS courses available. But I've been in the geospatial industry ever since then, so that's all about 36 years, so a long time.
Yeah, that's cracking. So you are obviously the founder of InTouch Geospatial. Can you tell us a bit about it and some of the services you offer?
Yeah, it's something I set up 13 years ago now. I'd had a long career of working in another consultancy and also in local authorities. And after a long career in those type of organisations, I thought the time had come to set up on my own. So back in 2012, I set up InTouch Geospatial Services, and generally working with other consultancies, often with people I'd actually worked with in the past, through people I knew through other organisations and old colleagues. But generally in the broader sort of environmental area of geospatial, whether it was through waste management, contaminated land, ecology, land suitability, land use, that type of thing. So these days tend to work direct with other consultancies, providing that sort of geospatial bit of the jigsaw to whatever project is that they're doing.
That's really interesting, especially about the environmental stuff, and we'll talk more about that later on in the podcast. So, from our conversations, you've spent many years working for and with local authorities. Can you tell us a bit about your experiences of working with them?
Yes, I mean my first experience with local authorities was really going back to 1992. I got a job as the GIS person in a local authority environment unit, ostensibly to sort of develop the mapping side of aspects to policy development. The environment unit that I was working in, it wasn't a statutory part of the local authority, so it was a bit more sort of research and development and proactive development of trying to get environmental aspects involved in council policies. So we ended up working on a lot of initiatives such as EMAS, the Eco Management and Audit Scheme. We were one of the first local authorities involved in doing carbon trading. The efficiencies that we were getting in energy management within the local authority, we were trading that. The savings we were making, we were trading that and getting an income from that. Involved in various EU projects. We had a project which was these days, unfortunately, called at the time Integrated System for Implementing Sustainability. I'll leave everybody to work out what the acronym for that one was. But a lot of my involvement was about integration of data. making better use of the data that we had available, and pulling that together to actually help inform policy decisions.
So that's such a huge breadth of work working with local authorities. And I bet back in the early 90s, towards even the late 90s, that would have been revolutionary for them to be doing that all with geographic data.
Yes, even just any data was, but certainly geographic data was. It was an interesting time. I think at that time in the early 1990s, a lot of local authorities had some form of GIS system, but it would often be around just providing access to Ordnance Survey mapping data, or would be under the guise of the Highways Department or the Planning Department. And the corporate-wide use of GIS that's now so commonplace within local authorities certainly wasn't there back in the early 1990s. But there was some really interesting sort of examples of data management, or maybe lack of data management at the time. It was very much departmental based and silo approach to how data was managed and stored. And we came across quite a few interesting issues through the work that we were doing, trying to bring these threads of data together. One example we had was with the EMAS work that we were doing, my role that sort of merged beyond just the geospatial into more environmental information management was providing quarterly reports on the council department's performance on energy, waste, water type of issues. One example that sticks in my mind was we had to integrate all the waste collection and recycling of waste from the different departments and the buildings that the different departments owned. And that data came from one section of the council, their recycling department, but the data that they were using, they were typing in the data from printed out sheets into a spreadsheet. When I got involved in it, I sort of took a workflow approach to it and looked at where they were getting the data from, and found that the printed out sheets that they were getting delivered by internal mail were actually being printed out from another section in environmental services, the other side of town. So I went over, literally walked over to this other department, saw what they were doing with their data, which came from a database, which they were then printing out to put into the brown internal mail envelopes to send to the other side of town for somebody there to actually retype the data in. So I thought that was just ridiculous. So with my involvement of it, we actually just did a data export from the database, and were then able to use that data directly without actually having somebody to type that data in. And those types of very silo departmental issues were very much the order of the day. I remember when we first had email in the council, the first email was you get a departmental email, and if you wanted to send an email to somebody, you'd send it to the departmental email, which was probably checked once a day by somebody in admin. And to get to the person that you'd sent the email to, they'd print the emails out, stick it in the brown internal mail envelopes, and put it through the internal post. So if you were lucky, the person that you wanted to send the email to might get it the next day if they were in the same building. But that was the early 1990s for you.
So you've already raised a huge number of potential challenges. Data integration's one, and you talk about data silos as another, and kind of mindsets of individuals. Which one of those aspects do you think was the greatest challenge when working within the local authority?
I think they were all interrelated. It was the way things had been done with the processes and the technology available at the time. So to some extent, it was understandable how those processes had got embedded into the local authority way of thinking. But because of the way local authorities tend to be, they tend to be quite slow at evolving and taking on the new technology and innovations. So it was all in amongst in itself, really, in that one issue led to another issue. And it has got a lot better. And certainly there's some really great sort of corporate thinking in local authorities now, which are bringing together all the different departments. But when I was a previous role I had, when I was working, I had 6 years working for Enviros Consulting. And we were involved in doing environmental risk assessments for housing stock transfers. The LSVT process for housing, the large-scale voluntary transfers. And that involved also working with local authorities, which, having had the experience of having 12 years working in the local authority previously, really sort of helped me understand how things were. But there was a really good, again, a really good example of that silo approach to work, where we were working with the environmental services section to understand and make better use of their contaminated land register data. They had a contaminated land register system set up, and whenever a new planning application came in for, say, a new housing development, they needed to cross-reference the planning application boundary with the contaminated land register to see if there was any potential issues. All sounds really, really good. When I actually saw the process and the workflow that they did with that, they literally had 2 computers set up, one which they'd been given for the contaminated land register, and one which was their now corporate GIS that all the planning applications came through. And rather than just switching on the layers and overlaying the layers, they literally had to switch on 2 computers, 2 computer screens, and do a visual check between one computer screen and another to see the potential overlap of the planning application boundary. And again, it was going in from the outside looking in and taking a more coordinated, integrated workflow approach, that I asked the question of, well, can we actually just transfer the data from one system into another? So you just need to switch the data on. And the environmental services person I was speaking to said, "Oh, yeah, that would be great. Didn't realise you could do that." So I then got to speak to the corporate IT guy that was managing the GIS service, and I asked him whether it was possible. He said, "Oh, yeah, we can do that." And I asked, "So, well, why hasn't that been done before?" So, "Oh, well, nobody asked." And so within a couple of days, they'd exported the data out of the standalone system, converted its file format and brought it into the corporate system so that they could then actually just switch the layers on and off and get an immediate comparison of the location of planning boundaries and contaminated land. And I think that was a really good example of how people they didn't know what was possible, so they didn't know what the questions were to ask to get it to be done.
I think that's a really vital point. Like you said, you've got to know what to ask, and if you just don't know that, then you're not going to be able to do it. So we're going to move away a little bit from the local authorities and challenges now. For the later part of your career, you've been heavily focused on environmental assessment mapping. Can you tell us a bit more about what that is?
Yes, it's something I really got involved in when I started at Enviros Consulting. I had 6 years working as a geospatial consultant, leading the GIS team in the UK within Enviros. It went through several change of hands, eventually became SKM Enviros, and was then sold on to what is now Jacobs. So it became part of the Jacobs consultancy. I actually then went freelance just before the sale to Jacobs. But through the work I did at Enviros, it was really interesting getting involved in this sort of broader environmental assessment that was both covering environmental impact assessments, EIAs, for things like wind farm planning applications. But also, this is where where there was the overlap with the housing side of things and the involvement with the housing transfer process. And it was part of the process of councils transferring their council housing stock to housing associations and private landlords. But as part of that process, it needed a due diligence in the sale of the properties, of the housing stock, to make sure that they weren't transferring any undue environmental risk. So we get brought in at various stages in that process to assess the housing stock, which could be normally somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 properties. I think the largest one I did was for County Durham, which was 12,000 properties, I think. So what we'd do is actually assess the environmental risk against a number of factors, the main one being potentially contaminated land based on historical land use. So if you've got an old iron and steel works that had been demolished and housing built on, not only would you want to know that there used to be an iron and steel works with the potential contamination from that, but the iron and steel works would have many different processes going on. So it would be not just identifying where the boundary of the old works were, but identifying the individual areas that were maybe the foundry, the blast furnace, oil storage areas. Any part of that process would have different potential for contaminations within the soil, which has then implications for any housing that is either built on top of that or maybe wanting to be built on top of that for new housing developments. But we also covered things like susceptibility to flooding, using the Environment Agency flood risk boundaries, issues to do with subsidence, either through the very makeup of the geology, but often incorporating old mine workings and coal pits, all the way through to individual aspects of the housing stock through use of things like the Housing Conditions Survey and presence of asbestos. And then the odd ones that would crop up on individual local authorities. So, for instance, the susceptibility to Japanese knotweed if there was any housing stock in proximity to watercourses, for instance. So the process of that was integrating all these potential environmental risks, assessing that against the proximity of the housing stock, and then assessing what that risk was, ultimately to be able to help inform the insurance cover. And if we could be more certain of what the risks, of where there were risks, and also give that certainty of where there weren't any risks, there's then the potential of actually saving the costs in the insurance premiums. It was really interesting in following that process all the way through to the end, because after we'd actually probably spent 3 or 4 months doing all this environmental assessment, against some issues which we can talk about around the beginnings of that, with actually combining in housing lists and address gazetteers. But the ultimate end result was us literally sitting in a big meeting room with representatives from the council, ourselves, the brokers that were managing the transfer process, and the insurance underwriters, using the GIS interactively to drill down to what individual houses were what risk. So if you imagine, as I said, I think the largest one we did was 12,000 properties. We could sit in a meeting room with the insurance underwriters who were going to be giving a quote, a price for the insurance cover for this process. And we could respond in real time to their questions of, oh, where do these two houses, why are those flagged up? And we could actually drill down into the historical maps and the data that we'd used so that they could see what that potential risk was. So if you had a large housing estate, rather than just considering the large housing estate or even a block of terraced houses, which if you flag those up as all being at risk, that would increase the insurance premiums. But being able to drill down to individual houses and individual properties to look at, well, it's probably only the end two of those properties that may be influenced by a bit of seepage of oil from a oil processing industry that had been there 100 years ago. It narrowed down the cover that was needed for the insurance and was saving money for the council through that process.
That's really interesting hearing you talk about for the better rate premiums, like looking at the individual house. Something I've noticed over the past couple of years is that insurers are now going back to that trend, because they were using postcode level analytics.
Yeah.
If you've got a big old postcode.
That was a lot of area.
Yeah, because they're all starting to use UPRN and things.
Yeah.
And then that's how they're doing things now. So that result from 20 odd years ago, 30 years ago, to now seeing it come back in full circle and knowing geospatial is at the heart of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So so for people who are unaware, there's a new bit of law called Biodiversity Net Gain, which is something that all developers and planners have to comply with. Can you tell us a bit more about what it is and what that means for housing providers?
Yes, I mean, it's legislation that came into force last year, and 12th of February 2024 was when the legislation came into force. Although it had been known about that it was going to be coming up for several years beforehand. So various developers had sort of been on the case before it actually came into legislation and been working up towards it. But essentially, it's basically that when you're putting in a new development for housing, for either small housing developments, couple of houses, through to large housing developments. I mean, I'm involved with one at the moment that's about 750 housing units. But essentially, it's trying to ensure that at the end of the construction of the development, you end up with a 10% more biodiversity value at the end of the construction of the development than when you started with the baseline, as it were. So the whole of the processes to go through is involving a lot of ecological surveys to get the baseline survey of what's there now, and then assessing the proposed development and comparing what's going to be at the end of the development to the baseline, and trying to ensure that the value of the biodiversity inherent within the development is 10% more than which you started with. And that it doesn't necessarily have to be within the development boundary itself, although it's that's sort of a preferred way of doing it. But through the way that the BNG process works, it allows you to buy in biodiversity value from off-site biodiversity units. So there's as well as there being the requirements for developers to assess the biodiversity, it's opened up a new market now for land managers to implement habitat improvements on their land and that get some income off that by selling on the increased biodiversity value to offset the requirements needed for new developments. So it's both a bit of a legislative headache and overhead up for the developers, but it's also opportunities for those that have got land that they want, that they see opportunities for improving the habitat there and getting some income off it as well.
So just for people who are unaware, biodiversity means the number of species in an area. So when we're talking about biodiversity net gain, let's say you've got 100 species, you need to make sure that those 100 species are potentially preserved, as well as an extra 10% of species coming through.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I studied biodiversity for my undergrad, so for me and you this is like really everyday normal talk.
The interesting thing, sorry to talk over you there, Chris, but the interesting thing about the BNG legislation is that while it's couched in terms of biodiversity, it doesn't actually have any requirement on biodiversity itself. It's all about habitats.
So this is perfect for our next question, I think.
Right.
Because through implementing BNG, there's been numerous challenges, I think is fair to say, with it. And that example you were just giving, actually, you're not talking about biodiversity in itself, we're talking about habitats value as a value.
Yeah.
You've subsequently created the BNG Spatial Insights Group. Can you tell us more about it and why you created it?
Yes, yeah, it's an interesting one in that all the legislation that came up and all the guidance that came up for implementing BNG that was all officially released back last year. It goes into quite a bit of detail about the processes needed to identify and calculate the biodiversity metric, which is based on habitat units. And a key part of that is the area of the habitat unit as well as its habitat code and hence value. But there is very little, if not, I think it mentions Ordnance Survey mapping once or twice in the guidance. There's practically no advice or guidance on how to go about mapping these habitat units accurately and correctly. And if the habitat units aren't mapped accurately, then the area calculations that the metric is based on aren't going to be accurate. And your final metric that's calculated, whether you're meeting the 10% net gain or is it 9.9% net gain, if you're not using accurate data, then the results that you're basing all of this on aren't going to be accurate either. And the BNG Spatial Insights Group was born out of this gap in knowledge and understanding of the mapping and geospatial aspects that are core to the BNG process. And it was born out of discussions on LinkedIn. Really, there was three of us that started sort of. We realised we were coming across the same problems, and we started a discussion. And 2 people, it's a discussion. 3 people, it's a group. So we thought we'd try and formalise that and raise awareness a bit. So we started the BNG Spatial Insights Group that has a group on LinkedIn, and we're also just about to launch a website that's just in its final stages of development, and that's at it's the BNG Spatial Insights Group at bng-sig.org is the address of the website. But it's very much about tackling BNG from a data and information point of view. And one of the founder members, Katie Dawson from Ecospatial, has developed a really good data standards framework called FRIDAS, which it's an acronym for the key aspects of the data framework that should be considered. But essentially, it's around making sure that the data you're using in the BNG metric is accurate, consistent, and reliable. And without that, whatever you're basing it on could have potential problems. Maybe not noticeable now, but because of the BNG requirements, there's a requirement for that over a 30-year period. And if those then get checked in 5 years' time, and it's seen that the data that everything was based on was inaccurate, there could be issues, financial and legal issues springing from that. So we're very much trying to get in good practice at the moment to make sure that the data people are using for BNG purposes is on very strong foundations.
I think one of my favourite bits, and I'd love you to explain this more, is there are some aspects to the mapping which aren't mentioned at all within the legislation. And the big one around that is slopes.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more, why does a slope matter within this?
Yes, it's an interesting one, and it's very much down to an individual site as to whether it's significant or not. But if you imagine looking at a map and you've got your site boundary on the map, and you're calculating it, we'll just take it for the overall site rather than individual habitats at the moment. But if you're calculating the area of the site area, any GIS software will give you the site area based on your red line. And that's all well and good if your site is flat, but going back to sort of school level mathematics and geometry and Pythagoras' theorem, if you think back to calculating the length of the slopey bit of the triangle, that length of the slopey bit of the triangle is going to be greater than the base of the triangle, the flat bit. And if you equate that into a site, that means that if the site is on a slope, then the slope area, or the area of the site calculated with the slope concern, is going to be bigger than the area just calculated from a flat map. And while because BNG is related to mainly development sites, it's not going to be hugely significant. It's going to be slightly different, but not hugely significant for a development site, or most development sites. But if you're then considering matching that with off-site habitat enhancement areas, then you might well have quite slopey areas that are being turned over to woodland, or you may have an area that's got some quite sort of gutted streams with sort of wanting to put back native oak woodland into the sides of the gullies. Then the slope area that you have is going to be significantly bigger than if you just calculated it from looking above from a map. And one site I was helping doing a BNG assessment on was for an area down in Bridgnorth, on just upon the hill above the River Severn, near the area where they have the funicular railway. So there's a bit of a clue in the fact that there's actually a funicular railway going up the side of this site, and the area of the site calculated with the slope impacted into it was 62% bigger than if calculated from flat land. Now, if you're trying to make sure that you've got 10% net gain in biodiversity, but you've got a variation in area of 62% because of the slope, then you can see that there's potential for some issues to arise with that.
Well, look, I was talking to someone about this exact problem the other day, and they were like, why does it matter? And I said, well, imagine if you bought a plot of land at the Cliffs of Dover. You buy just a 30 metre long by 10 metre stretch. Well, that's only going to be 300 square metres. But actually, if you're incorporating that huge cliff as well, your surface area is much more. And I'm like, oh, that's nuts. And like you said, 62% increase in area because of slope. I think that is massive potential, especially for the credit side.
Yeah.
I think that's quite a clever way to do it. Especially if you know your development's going to be a bit off, you're not going to meet it. You can buy other land. I guess that's similar to how carbon credits work, isn't it?
Yeah. It's coming back to having confidence in the data that you're basing your decisions on.
Mm.
And I mean, another aspect on that, again, which it's often one of those things where when I explain it to people, they think, oh, I've never even thought of that. But now that you say it, it's obvious.
Yeah.
But another aspect of that is like when you're marking up the different habitats or even a site boundary on a map, when you're transferring that into a digital representation in GIS, you often end up tracing over a site boundary that somebody has drawn. And that then, the accuracy in which you're capturing that site boundary is then dependent on the thickness of the line that was originally drawn and the scale of the map that it was drawn on.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
So if you've got take for example, if you've got a 1 to 2,000 scale map, so that's quite a large scale map, 1 to 2,000 scale map. The scale, if you work it out on the scale, 1 millimeter on the map is equal to 2,000 millimeters in real life. That's 2 meters. Oh, wow. So if you've drawn a line with a pen that's 1 millimeter thick, if you're capturing and digitizing and tracing over that line, you could be out by 1 millimeter or 2 meters in real world coordinates, real world distances. So if you're got a site boundary that's 100 meters long, and you could be out by 2 meters over that 100 meters length, you've got a potential site area difference just on that section of 200 square meters.
Yeah, that's huge potential.
Which is huge potential for error. And also, if you're then multiply that up by all the errors of all the different habitat polygons, where you haven't quite mapped the habitat polygons exactly abutting each other, and you might have overlaps and gaps, the more polygons that you're digitizing in a geospatial representation of it, the more cumulative error that you're actually got that then gets aggregated up at the for your final statistics.
So yeah, massive potential, especially if legislators or town planners are looking at that data years later and realising, oh, you're well above that 10% threshold, but actually you're 7.8 or 8.2.
Yeah, and there's some very easy techniques within the GIS software that can avoid that. I know there'll be some listeners with varying levels of geospatial knowledge on this podcast, but one of the ways to help avoid that is, rather than cumulatively digitizing all the habitat polygons where you've got potential for slight overlaps and slight gaps, if you start with the entirety of the site and then just split it and subdivide it, you're not going to get those overlaps because you're just splitting one polygon into multiple parts. And there's the other obvious one of using the snapping tools. So when you're digitizing, you're snapping to the existing boundaries and then using the auto trace functions that are available in a lot of GIS software to then follow the neighboring boundary. So you're not getting gaps or overlaps.
That's a really cool way of thinking about it. I thought of the snapping one, but I hadn't thought about the segmenting way.
Yeah, that is. I have read some guidance that was produced about using GIS in BNG, and that was certainly one of the approaches that it recommended there. Start off with your site boundary and subdivide it. The flip side of that, though, is that then assumes that you've got your site boundary correct in the first instance.
Yeah. So, coming up to the very final question, and this has kind of become a bit of a running one now. If you had an unlimited budget, what would you like to do with it?
Not buy anything other than time, I think, is I'd use the budget for training and raising awareness of what people already have and what they can already do with what they've got if they just knew how to do it. I think what we don't need is yet more apps that people are just going to install, have a play with for a little while, and then get confused with that because it doesn't quite do what they want. But there's so much technology already out there. And one of the things it had been a growing feeling for a number of years probably, but I finally managed to sort of put it into words last year. And it's the realization that the rate of technology change is much more rapid than the rate of organizational change. And what that means is that there's ever more people being left behind in the race for doing the latest new whiz-bang technology. Yet they're really struggling to actually do what they're trying to do with the technology they already have. So I'd use that budget to buy the time so that people can really understand the tools that they've already got. Everybody is so busy that it's very difficult to find the time to actually just step back from the processes that they're doing to try and find a better way. And often what I say to a lot of my clients is, if you sat there thinking, surely there must be a better way than this, then there usually is. But it takes time just to take that step back and reassess what it is you're really trying to do to find the better way of doing things. So it's very much about using the tools and the information that you already have, but in a much more efficient and better way than currently struggling with.
That reminds me a lot of Einstein's quote, where you spend 90% of your time thinking about the problem and then 10% actually doing it.
Oh yeah, that comes to another of my phrases, which is the hardest part of any problem is working out what the question is.
Yeah, but that's a really good take, and actually one that I quite agree with. We're going to leave it there today because we know we can pick up so much of this. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been brilliant.
It's been a pleasure.
If anyone who has listened today wishes to get in touch, what's the best way for them to do so?
So I've got a website, intouchgeospatial.com, and you can reach me via email on intouchgeospatial@gmail.com. Or here's a really retro approach. People can pick up the phone and phone me. My phone number is 07806 816 116. Happy to have a chat with anybody about any aspect of geospatial, and it'd be really good just to chat with people, as we are doing now, which has been great.
Thank you so much. And to our listeners today, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to get involved in this podcast, please feel free to get in touch. You can either find us on our website, www.housinggeospatial.co.uk, or on our LinkedIn page. Thank you very much, and catch you next time.
Cheers, Chris. That's been great.